Why did the persuasive speaker always wrap up their speech with a conclusion? Because they knew that if they didn't, their audience would be left in a state of confusion. Oh, that's too good.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
The last lesson on persuasive texts. No surprises here. We are looking at conclusions. 2 conclusions to be precise. One for each question that we planned for and wrote an introduction for. You know how it goes. Make sure you've watched the previous 4 lessons and completed their related activities before continuing with this lesson, because otherwise this content will seem very out of context. Let's do it. Lesson objectives. We're going to recap something, and that is the structure of the conclusion, the bottom funnel. Then we will analyze example 1 by recapping step 5 of the planning steps, recapping the title and the introduction, recapping the body paragraphs, and then analyzing the conclusion. We'll do a similar thing with example 2. We will recap step 5 of the planning steps, then we'll recap the title and the introduction. We didn't analyze any body paragraphs in relation to example 2, so we'll just skip straight to analyzing the conclusion instead. After that, we'll do this thing that we do at the end of every lesson. We'll outline a simple summary. Then we will say goodbye to persuasive texts for now. Let's recap the structure of the conclusion, the bottom funnel. This is our bare bottom funnel. Our elementless bottom funnel. Here are the elements, starting with our thesis. At this stage of the conclusion, our job is to restate the thesis element of the introduction, but with different words and syntax. Once we've done that, we'll turn to the reasons element. Here, we summarize the main point of each body paragraph and reiterate the relevance of reason 1, reason 2, and reason 3 to the thesis. Next and second last element is the call to action, or CTA. This is where we tell the audience to do something that's actionable and specific related to the thesis and underscore the urgency of doing so. Final element of our conclusion is the general statement. Our job in this final part of the conclusion is to exaggerate the significance of the topic that you have discussed and your overarching argument. Remember, the theme of this final part of our persuasive speech is kairos. Kairos is the category of rhetoric that involves the speaker conveying a sense of urgency and or opportunity to the audience. Returning to our elements for just a second. The acronym for these 4 elements is TRCG. Nah. Let's just go with trained rats catch goats instead. Structure of the conclusion recapped. Let's turn to example number 1. One more time, here's this question. I don't think you quite understand the ramifications of this decision. Incorporate this statement into a persuasive text for a resistant audience. The planning steps recapped. Here's step 5 of the planning steps for this question. Pause the video and read the following underlined element of this step of the planning steps. Try and identify where those underlined elements appear in the following conclusion that we're going to read out. Before we get to that conclusion, here is a quick recap of the paragraphs that we've analyzed so far. This is the title and introduction that we looked at 2 lessons ago. And here are the body paragraphs that we looked at in the previous lesson. Here's BP1, BP2, the big boy, and BP3. If it's been more than 3 days since you completed the lesson on body paragraphs, pause the video and have a quick skim of the intro and those body paragraphs before I start reading out our conclusion. Okay, if you're with me now, I'm assuming that you're pretty familiar with those other paragraphs of this response that we've already analyzed in the previous 2 lessons. If you are, nothing else left to do but to look at this conclusion. Here's the original version. Here is the deconstructed version. Starting with the thesis. We all need to create digital boundaries in our lives, and we need to do so now. Here is the reasons element. Why? Well, at the beginning of my talk today, I presented you with a choice: to ignore everything I say or to establish digital boundaries in your life. There are 3 significant ramifications of failing to develop digital boundaries. The first is a reduced attention span, the second relates to lost time, and the third is heightened feelings of anxiety. Next up, we have the call to action, or CTA. If, however, you decide to establish digital boundaries in your life, there is a sense of urgency here, because the longer you continue your current social media habits, the greater your risk of suffering from these 3 ramifications concerning attention span, time, and anxiety. I know I've said a lot today, and I want to make this transition to digital boundaries as easy as possible for you. With that in mind, if you can do anything as a result of today's talk, it would be the following: set screen time limits for social media apps that you use the most and stick to them. That's all I ask. Last but not least, we have our general statement. After doing this over the coming months, I assure you, you'll be able to smash out that uni assignment on climate change without getting distracted. Thank you all so much for being so attentive. Please feel free to come up and ask me any questions as you leave the gym. Short and sweet, let's check out some comments. Discussing the thesis first. There could not be a more simple way of restating what my thesis is, my main argument. Note the use of the following words. Need implies that creating digital boundaries is a matter of necessity. It's not a want, it's a need. It exaggerates the importance of my thesis. Also, the word our has connotations of we're in this together. Turning to another point, remember that the theme of this conclusion is kairos, which involves conveying a sense of opportunity and or urgency. I'm conveying urgency through this phrase, we need to do so now. Specifically, through the repetition of the word need twice in this sentence, the use of the word now, and the use of an exclamation point. Regarding the exclamation point, consider the difference between this version on the slide and this version. The first version has an exclamation point at the end. The second version doesn't, it just has a full stop. Which version conveys more urgency? Let's discuss a few things regarding the reasons element. In my introduction for this speech, I said, if you decide to ignore what I've said, 3 main things will occur. Your attention span will continue to decrease, you'll lose hours each day, and you'll exacerbate anxious feelings. In the first 2 sentences of this reasons element of the conclusion, I'm referring to that choice that I gave the audience in the introduction. Referring back to the content of the introduction creates a circular structure and enhances the whole text cohesion. This next sentence, there are 3 significant ramifications of failing to develop digital boundaries, serves 2 functions. Firstly, it uses the word ramifications, which tells the marker that I'm engaging with aspects of the statement in the question. Secondly, it transitions to restating my 3 reasons. Speaking of my reasons, this final sentence of the reasons element restates my 3 reasons which constituted my 3 body paragraphs. I haven't bothered to reword each reason considering it's a speech that's listened to, so clarity is the main priority, and oftentimes clarity can be achieved through repetition. Second final element of the conclusion is the CTA. Kairos. I literally say in this first sentence, there is a sense of urgency here because the longer you continue with your current social media habits and so on. Sometimes you can convey urgency through the pace of your voice. If you're speaking very quickly, it creates a frantic pace and people are thinking, oh my God, what should I do? He's speaking so quickly, maybe I need to do something really quickly. But you can also convey urgency through the words you use, and if you just want to be direct with it, you can say there is a sense of urgency here. This part of the CTA also explains why there is a sense of urgency, and that's because the longer the audience waits to establish digital boundaries, the more at risk they are from suffering from these 3 ramifications. Because there is a pretty valid reason for why they should do something quickly, the audience will be more inclined to do what you've asked of them. Consider the difference in the following. Run! Quick! Run! There's a spider behind you. In the first example, I'd be like, what? No, I'm not going to run. I hate running. In the second one, I'd be like, tell the audience why there is a sense of urgency or opportunity. Let's focus on the actual call to action among these sentences. If you can do anything as a result of today's talk, it would be the following. Set screen time limits for social media apps that you use the most and stick to them. I make it very easy for the audience to understand that I have one thing I want them to do. Out of everything they've heard, out of everything I've spoken about, all I want them to do is this one thing. And that is to set screen time limits for social media apps. That is actionable. It's something the audience can do. They're within their means to do that thing. I'm not telling them to go and do a backflip off a Tesla in a nightclub. And it's very specific. I'm not saying use your phone less. I'm saying, yes, use parts of your phone less, but do that by implementing this very specific setting on your phone. Also, you might recall the activity that I went through with my so-called audience in body paragraph 2. It was where I asked the audience to take the next minute to pull out your phones, go into settings, and determine what your average screen time is on social media apps. 1 minute later. Okay, has everyone got their number? So I saw earlier in my speech that the audience is within their means to actually set screen time limits because they checked them previously. So that further reinforces the effectiveness of this call to action. I know they can do it, and it's very specific. A brief point about this final sentence, that's all I ask. It uses short syntax. This sentence is very short. That's all suggests that I'm not asking much of the audience. It's designed to make each audience member think, after the entire speech, all he wants us to do is set screen time limits. I could probably do that. Finally, let's discuss the general statement. This first sentence refers back to the opening hypothetical situation in the introduction about trying to complete an English assignment but constantly getting distracted. The first reference to this situation in the introduction is framed as a problem, the problem being constant distraction. The second reference to this hypothetical situation in the conclusion is framed as a solution. That solution being you'll be able to smash out that assignment. Framing your hypothetical situation in this problem solution structure through your introduction and conclusion respectively is a really nice way of implying that what you have spoken about and what you are telling the audience to do is helping them solve the problem that was introduced in the introduction. These final two sentences represent another way of subtly telling the marker that you are adhering to or following the conventions of the genre of form and structure, which is a persuasive speech. If you think about it, most people would say something like this after speaking to a bunch of year 11s and 12s. I'll say it again, the best ways to incorporate the conventions of a persuasive speech is to imagine you are literally in the shoes of the person giving that speech. Example 1, done. Here's example 2. And this is how change happens. One gesture, one person, one moment at a time. Incorporate this quote in a persuasive text that uses language features to target a specific audience. Here's a recap of the planning steps, namely step 5 of those steps. Pause the video, check out the underlined elements. Take note of how those elements pop up in the following conclusion. Also, because we didn't analyze any body paragraphs in relation to this question, it's probably been at least a few days since you completed the lesson on introductions, which was the last time we saw this text. So it would be worth rereading the title and the introduction just so you know what we're talking about here. Remember, the conclusion includes much of the same content in the introduction, but in reverse. See if you notice that in this conclusion. Original version, deconstructed version. Thesis. If you want to unleash the potential of your ADHD rather than let it weigh you down, you need to create a second brain. Reasons element. Throughout today's talk, I've discussed how we're overloaded with information, highlighted that our brain is actually for creating ideas, not storing them, and addressed one of the most common concerns I hear from people regarding the actual process of creating a second brain. It looks like too much effort. I acknowledge that the process does involve effort, but reminded you that anything worthwhile does. Moving to the CTA. Harnessing the potential of our ADHD doesn't happen overnight, but through consistent and repeated actions over time. And this is how change happens. One gesture, one person, one moment at a time. If anything I've said today has resonated with you and you'd like to delve deeper into this concept of a second brain, I suggest you create a Notion account. It's free for students, and watch some of Thomas Frank's YouTube videos about creating a second brain. If you truly want to get into the nitty-gritty, go check out my latest book, Creating a Second Brain. Finally, the general statement. If you do either of these things and follow the principles, I promise you'll be able to binge Stranger Things in peace without wondering whether you've just forgotten about brekkie with your best mate. Thanks a bunch for listening, and I wish you all the best with your path of learning about your ADHD. That is the final paragraph of persuasive text that we will be analyzing finished after these comments. So, this thesis is all about urgency and opportunity. The words unleash and need convey a sense of urgency and opportunity. Specifically, need creates urgency and unleash conveys opportunity. Also, this highlighted part on the slide incorporates polarization. Either you unleash the potential of your ADHD or you let it weigh you down. Basically, the use of polarization here conveys the underlying message: you'll struggle if you disagree with what I'm saying. This final phrase, "you need to create a second brain," is a clear restatement of my overarching argument, my thesis. Taking a look at the reasons element. Remember how I said in high school English, it's taboo to write, "In this essay, I will blank." However, in a speech, there's nothing wrong with explicitly telling the audience what your main reasons are. This is because in the case of real life speeches, the audience typically doesn't have access to a transcript in real time of the speech. Therefore, being crystal clear with your words is very important. In the introductions lesson, well, saying throughout today's talk I've discussed in the reasons element of the conclusion is like saying I will be talking about XYZ in the reasons element of the introduction. This phrase also tells the audience that I'm about to summarize my speech's main points, which encourages them to listen closely. This part of the reasons element restates 2 of my 3 reasons why the audience should create a second brain, representing the first 2 body paragraphs. This would have been the subject of body paragraph 1, and this would have been the subject of body paragraph 2. In this conclusion, I've acknowledged a counter-argument. My thesis is that the audience should create a second brain. I've imagined my audience having the following objection to my overarching argument of creating a second brain, which is that it looks like too much effort. So here I am restating what the counter-argument is, and I'm restating my rebuttal to that counter-argument. Remember, the rebuttal also represents your third reason why the audience should follow your thesis. So my rebuttal and third reason is, yeah, it does create effort, but anything worthwhile takes a lot of effort. And if something is worthwhile, the amount of effort it takes to get it is pretty redundant. Also note that in example 1, this is example 2, I only address my reason 3 in the reasons element of the conclusion, and I didn't reiterate what the counter argument was. The bare minimum is restating all 3 reasons, but if you can also reiterate what the counter argument is, that's great. After the reasons element, we had the CTA, focusing on the first 5 sentences. The first sentence's purpose is to transition to incorporating the statement in the question. That statement is, and this is how change happens, one gesture, one person, one moment at a time. Without this first sentence, the statement wouldn't fit in this conclusion as well. This is what the relevant parts of the conclusion sound like without this first sentence. Here is the last sentence from the reasons element, and here is the next sentence or the statement from the question that would be the start of the call to action element if we deleted that sentence that comes before it that transitions to it. I acknowledge that the process does involve effort, but reminded you that anything worthwhile does. And this is how change happens. One gesture, one person, one moment at a time. So here's an important point. Whenever you're asked to incorporate a statement, you should aim to do so seamlessly. Almost to the point where the marker could read over it and think that the contents of that statement that you're required to incorporate are your own. The emboldened part of the CTA is my actual CTA, and for this CTA, I have given the audience 2 options. The first is targeted at an audience that is mildly interested in what I've said. They can create a Notion account and watch some YouTube videos. The second is targeted at audience members who are very interested in what I said. If anyone was very interested, they could go and check out my latest book. Both options are still actionable and specific. Also, it's pretty useful to think about your audience's personal context when thinking about a CTA that's actionable. For instance, this CTA is better suited to the audience of second year uni students than the audience of year 11s and year 12s. This is because uni students typically have more time on their hands to explore this stuff. The CTA is more actionable for uni students than it is for high school students. Finally, let's discuss the general statement. Once Once again, we're seeing this aspect of the general statement referring back to the opening hypothetical situation that I mentioned in the introduction. Ultimately, this is creating a connection between the introduction and the conclusion. Again, this is a minor thing to do, but it's an awesome way to leave a great final impression on your marker. What I'm really getting at in this sentence of the general statement is that if you follow what I've said in my speech, you won't have to deal with the problems outlined in my introduction that people with ADHD commonly experience. Starting with the problem in the introduction, ending with the solution in the conclusion. Also, thanks a bunch for listening creates a relatable voice, and this is the type of voice I wanted to convey per step 4 of the planning steps for this question. The final few words of my speech are your path of learning about ADHD. This phrase helps conclude on a positive note. It suggests that learning about your ADHD is a gateway to mastering it. Compare this ending to something like, as we know, ADHD is a difficult disorder to manage, but we can learn to get through it together. That last version just doesn't have the same positivity and optimism that the first version does. And that's mainly because of the connotations of words such as difficult, disorder, manage, get through it. All of those words leave a bit of a bitter taste, and that's not how I wanted to end my speech. I wanted to be more optimistic about ADHD, so this original version was more suitable. All of that is to say, it is important to consider the connotations of the words you use. That's a wrap. This is a simple summary. This lesson started with a recap of the structure of an introduction, the bottom funnel. Our mnemonic, trained rats catch goats. The theme is kairos. The T in that mnemonic stands for thesis. This element of the conclusion requires you to restate the thesis element of the introduction, but with different words and different syntax. The R stands for reasons, and this is where you summarize the main point of each body paragraph and indicate the relevance of reason 1, 2, and 3 to your thesis. The C stands for call to action, or CTA. The CTA requires you to tell the audience to do something that is relevant to your thesis and underscore the urgency of doing so. Final element is the general statement. This is where you exaggerate the significance of your topic and your overarching argument, your thesis. After our recap, we had a discussion of example 1 and example 2. Here are some key takeaways regarding each element of the conclusion in relation to our discussion of these examples. Some key takeaways regarding the thesis. Firstly, consider how you can use diction, word choice, and punctuation to create a sense of urgency and opportunity, which, as you'll recall, is the theme of the bottom funnel. For example, we need to do so now. The word need creates a sense of urgency. The exclamation point heightens that urgency. Also, restate your thesis using the same or similar diction you use to refer to it throughout your speech. Here's some important stuff regarding the reasons element. First, refer back to the contents of the activate in the introduction so you can create a circular structure and enhance the text's cohesiveness. Another one, you can summarize your 3 reasons by using the same diction, the same words you use throughout your speech. Next, it's acceptable to employ phrasing such as throughout today's talk I've discussed in a persuasive speech. Finally, aim to reiterate the counter-argument in addition to your 3 reasons in this part of the conclusion. Next up was the CTA. Firstly, it's helpful to explain why the audience should act quickly. Remember the example I gave you between run! What? No, I'm not going to run. I hate run. Quick! Run! There's a spider behind. I'm more inclined to do the thing I'm being told to do if I'm given a compelling reason why. Also, ensure the CTA is suitable for your specific audience. For example, telling a bunch of second-year uni students to read a book during the holidays, pretty reasonable, but telling second-year uni students to read a book during an exam period, not that suitable. Finally, whenever you're asked to incorporate a statement, you should aim to do so seamlessly, almost to the point where the marker could read over it and think that the contents of that statement are your own. Last element is the general statement. Firstly, the general statement represents another opportunity to refer to the activate from your introduction. And remember how we said that the activate in the intro should introduce a problem or frame the situation as a problem. And then your reference to that situation in the conclusion indicates that the problem can be or has been solved through your speech's recommendations. In the conclusion, you're referring to the same situation from the intro, but you've framed it as a solution now. If there is one thing you can take away away from the last few lessons on persuasive speeches, it would really be this final point. The best way to incorporate conventions of a persuasive speech is to imagine you are literally in the shoes of the person giving it. And that officially concludes this module segment on persuasive text. At this stage, I really hope you've been able to see the overlap between responding section essays and persuasive texts. And it's because of this overlap that I suggested you choose persuasive text as your first text type preference for Module 5. Speaking of the other text types, depending on what your preferences are, you'll either be moving to imaginative text next or interpretive text next, or if persuasive texts are your last preference, you'll be moving on to the review lesson. Wherever you're going, well done on watching all of these lessons on persuasive text. You've got one more thing to do before putting this text type to bed, and that is finishing off your response or responses by writing the conclusion. Remember, it's not how he starts, but how he finishes, so finish strong, and I'll see you soon. Until then, keep it simple.